Welcome to another episode of Inspired Content. This is a book week, and I'll be taking a look at Brainchild, a novel by George Turner. I've never heard of it, so I'll take a look at that and see what kinds of ideas it inspires. So, see you on the other side. Brainchild. I would have to say I'm giving this a 9.4 out of a 9.5. This has to be one of my new absolute favorite books. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, and I mean I can't tell for sure the little nitpicks that I have on this, if they're because I wish it had been done differently at certain points, specifically the ending. I feel like I can't tell for sure whether or not I'm just wishing it had taken a different route for that message, or that certain things had been done differently. Not that what they did was wrong, it's just I want it to go a different way. But there's also a real sense to me that in reading it, the whole story is really nicely done, carries through, and then it feels like the ending is something, like he set aside the vast majority of the book and set it aside for 3 or 4 years and then came back to it and then wrote an ending on it. But in the time difference between writing the first part and writing the second part, it's almost like he forgot where he was going with the story, or it was like he had to restart, and it didn't mesh with the rest of the story. I legitimately felt like that last bit of the story, I felt like the main character was somebody else entirely, and not just in the sense of it could have been any other guy. It read to me almost like the main character was some girl from a different book instead of the guy that we'd been following the whole way through. And he doesn't do some strange thing that would make that work sensically. There's nothing that should have had that happen. But it's written almost like an entirely different person wrote the end to that. And it almost feels like the person who wrote that end didn't read the first rest of the book. It just felt a little weird to me. But the thing is, that's the only part of the story I really didn't care much for. This was a good book. So, alright, the ideas it inspired. My mind says it would be sort of more topical now, and perhaps a more interesting look at humanity and our relation to our own technology if we did it an AI, genetically engineered humans, and then the third group being cyborged human, or even reanimated dead. I don't know. AI, engineered before birth and then reanimated dead with cybernetic technology? I don't know. I mean, I think the exploration of our relation to how far can you go before something is not human anymore, and that fear of it, could be a story element using a similar kind of 3 groups trying to engineer something more than human than fearing what you got. Part of me says that if you were having a story of a superhuman who gets out into the world, and you're playing it as what happens when they have access to the world and have free reign to do what they want and nobody knows they're out there, it would seem to me that if one was intent on throwing a monkey wrench in human society, that sperm banks would be a really great place to start throwing things over a cliff. Because if they are genetically engineered to be able to produce a greater intellect, and depending on whether it's a dominant trait in breeding, making a donation to sperm banks is one of those things that, like, you basically infected the rest of humanity with something that'll carry forward through breeding. And so it's sort of like, at one sense, it's sort of like an infection of the rest of humanity, and at another point, it's sort of kind of like a merging of the two groups that may seem at odds or something like that. So now, I really felt early on that, like, there were implications that there were actually 4 groups. I mean, they state that there were more than 3 groups, but 3 groups are the only ones that survived to grow up. But the fourth group died in infancy, and there may have been another one that never even, one or two that never became fully viable. I'm a little vague on, they only mentioned that once or twice, but the 4th group that died after birth, there's a feeling like they can't figure out why it happened. It was just a mysterious death, and there was a part of me that felt like maybe one of the other groups, through some means undetectable or unknown, caused the death of the others. And the story is sort of the story could be uncovering which of the types of genius that the other groups became was the one who's sociopathic enough to eliminate another group. And the way you kind of start to really piece that together is realizing what would be the potential of this 4th group, and what would make them who would they be a threat to in the other groups. They'd all have a set of genes that make them that group, but everything else was specifically engineered to be as humanly different from one another as possible to make a stable breeding stock. If you want to breed more of that line, you would want enough diversity to make a stable breeding stock. It's also possible to do something similar for each of the other groups, so that in those situations you have the breeding between 2 groups to see if you can combine those traits. As long as they're not breeding outside that stock, the ability to not have to engineer from scratch each batch attempting to do this, being able to have subsequent generations and see about how it carries forward, would be more scientifically valid method of doing it. If you really wanted to take the story to a sort of a future science fiction level, I think you could also do the idea of engineering this superhuman breeding stock that then the elites would want to be the fathers or mothers of their children, so that their children can have an advantage. Instead of having to engineer your child from scratch, just engineer the perfect stud or mare for a perfect human, and kind of sell that breeding right. What would have made a more interesting story, and something that, like, I kept looking for hints that it was going this way, would be if instead of, you don't have to have the other 2 groups, but instead of him escaping, coming back, telling them something, and they all kind of quit, you have instead, they all feel trapped, they let one escape to set up certain key events, while the ones that remain inside set up other key events, so that when they all come back together and trigger those events, it allows the majority of them to escape. In my mind, I'm thinking that, part of it is also the guy who escapes spends time in the outside world because he knows he's the one who's going to have to make the sacrifice so that the others can escape and stay out and move on, and nobody will look for them, because part of what they're setting up is some of those things in the story they include are things like messing with the minds of humans so that they don't know what's happened as much as they think they do. And so setting up a situation in which everybody believes they're dead. There's no chance of them being out in the world. And it takes one of them to set that circumstance up so that they believe that to be the case. But the rest of them are out there. And the story goes on that somewhere else in the world, other countries and other organizations are starting programs similar to that. And they may be getting tips and information, steering things into a direction that these children grown up, no longer thought to exist in the world, are influencing things to create more of their own kind in the world, so that they're not alone in the world. So this sort of like this game that they play with setting the clues in the minds of everybody else that makes them stop thinking to look, so that they can be out in the world unsupervised and no longer in the control of an organization or a group. Just free to do what they need to do to be them. That an organization or a country goes to the trouble of creating these superhuman beings, and they create a small batch of them, and they control them, or they try to control them and keep them as sort of lab animals, giving them answers and results for things they want. But all the while they set up this opportunity for one of them to get outside into the world. And the thing they have to keep in mind is they're still human beings. And so whatever makes them amazing exists in some degrees in the outside populations. And so having that potential be there in other people, maybe they're Asperger's or other groups of people who we don't look to for their gifts and capabilities, but somebody who has fully tapped into the potential of superhuman thought processes may see those potentials and find a way to tap them, so that when he gets to the outside world, he doesn't have to breed, he doesn't have to help his siblings escape and start new programs to engineer new kids. We've got people in the world that when he or she, the person who escapes this population of engineered people with super intellects, gets out into the world, that intellect that he or she has, makes it possible for them to fully tap the potentials of people that we are ignoring and missing. And so their legacy is the empowerment of the people we ignored to do things that we didn't ever achieve on our own. It's realizing the potential of the things about ourselves we ignore as a population. And I actually like that story concept a lot more. I do think I want to potentially explore that in some writing in the future. But you're welcome to do so as well, because I hope there was some inspiration in some of these ideas here. And I'd love to hear about anybody who creates something from these ideas, be it games or stories or movies or shorts. I'd love to see something created this way. So, happy creating, and I'll see you for the next episode.